Hello, this is Pastor Brian Wolfmueller of Table Talk Radio. Hey, pay attention, because you're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 380. Thank you so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week again this week. Glad to have you with us. If you are new to the show, welcome aboard. Hope you enjoy it, and I hope you will come back in the future to peruse some of our back catalog. Check out future episodes. If you are a returning member, welcome back. It's great to have you here with us. It's been a busy week. It was kind of crazy. I was actually hoping that we would do something different, but couldn't work out schedules with the pastor. Just so much going on with my work and with school and volleyball and all kinds of stuff. So didn't get to do what I was hoping to do this week. So you're stuck listening to me, the Armed Lutheran. It's my podcast. So, hey, there you go. It kind of works. But I know you all love hearing from the pastor. I know you all love hearing from Sergeant Bill and from Mia Anstein as well. They are awesome. And hopefully we will have some content from them in the near future. I think next week we're going to be doing our online hangout for October. And then the week after that, we'll try to get a variety show so you can hear from everybody again. Haven't done a full variety show in a while. But before we get to today's show, which is sort of a follow-up on last week's show about what's been going on in the Middle East, I want to give a big thank you to all the members of the Reformation Gun Club, the people who make this show possible. The members who, for those of you who are new to the show, who haven't listened before, we are listener funded. We don't have any advertising. We don't have any sponsors. So to make all of this possible, and you might wonder, well, what does it take to make all this possible? Well, it requires subscriptions to hosting services. It requires subscriptions to for our domain names and all the stuff that we do at the store, and things like the software that we use to record our online hangouts, equipment, software licensing, and all that kind of stuff. The people who make all that possible are the members of the Reformation Gun Club who contribute to this show through their membership dues on an annual basis. And we really, really appreciate all of them for what they do to help make this happen every week. And today I want to give a special shout out to Curtis from Junction City, Kansas, Justin from Berryville, Arkansas, William from Bentonville, Arkansas. Those three are regulars at our online hangouts, by the way, and looking forward to seeing everyone again next week. Frank from Lake City, Michigan, Catherine from Casper, Wyoming, Paul from Sheridan, Wyoming, Jim from Fort Wayne, Indiana, Rob from DeKalb, Illinois, Mitch from Stockbridge, Michigan, and Ron from Lexington Park, Maryland. Thank you all, and thank you to all of the members of the Reformation Gun Club for your continued support over the years. Folks, if you would like to come and join us for these online hangouts, if you'd like to hear your name announced on the show when I do these thank yous, if you would like to get access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content and some cool Armed Lutheran swag, and that warm, fuzzy feeling you get knowing you made all this possible, go check it out at reformationgunclub.com. Memberships start at $15.17 per year. That's like $1.26 per month if you break it down. So Not a whole lot to ask to help keep all of this going. We really do appreciate it. Check it out today at reformationgunclub.com, or look for a link in the show notes for this or any of our previous episodes. All right, now before we get started, I do want to mention a couple of housekeeping things. Halloween, of course, is coming up, which is also Reformation Day if you are a Lutheran. That is October 31st, and if you like a good scary story, I've got a great book for you. It's called An Executioner's Tale. It's set in post-Reformation Germany, featuring a reluctant but honorable executioner who's called on to perform a questionable execution under some unusual circumstances, and that unravels this whole tale of intrigue, which results in him being haunted by the woman he has to kill. It's my first work of fiction. It came out last fall, I believe it was October or November. I think it came out early October of 2022. Find it, yes, 2022. And it's available at Amazon, or there are signed copies available on the website. Also, just to warn you, it's not a kid's book. It has some language and some situations in it that and you don't want to share with your kids. It's more for older kids, older adults. It is an adult-themed work of fiction. It is, and by saying adult-themed, it's not porn. It don't get the wrong idea. It just, you wouldn't want to read this to your kids is all I'm saying. But it's perfectly fine. If you'll read John le Carré, or if you'll read, Craig Johnson, or who's another one? Tom Clancy, you wouldn't read those books to your kids, right? They're adult situations, things that they won't really understand, some language that's not appropriate. So it is a book for adults. Let's put it that way. It's for adult readers. Okay, I get myself out of that. That sounded awful. But okay, there is a book for younger readers that I wrote early and released earlier this year. It focuses on the fifth commandment, the command from God that not only that we don't murder, but that we defend our neighbors in need, it's a fitting theme given what we're going to be talking about in this episode, as you will see shortly. It's made for young readers. This one is for kids 12 and under, I would say, 13 and under. It's called The Fifth Command, and it is set in an interesting fantasy world. It features a cast of characters who may or may not be loosely based on the contributors to your favorite podcast. There's even a free reading guide that you can download for parents so that you can discuss the issues that are raised in the book. Got supplemental Bible readings and for further discussion, all that kind of stuff. It is a fun story. There's even a sequel coming out probably early next year that is in the final stages of editing. And you can check that out. It's called The Fifth Command. The other book is called An Executioner's Tale. And those are on Amazon. You can get them in electronic format, Kindle format. You can download the EPUB format from the Armed Lutheran shop, which means you're not paying Amazon, you're paying me. All that comes out of what you pay for the book, if you buy from the store, especially if you buy the EPUB version as opposed to the Kindle version, more of the royalties go to me as opposed to going to Amazon. And then Amazon gives me a little bit. So check those out, armedlutheran.us/books. And hope you'll check them out and grab a copy today. Okay. As you've probably noticed, there's been a surprising amount of support in U.S. cities for mass murder over the past 2 weeks. We've had rallies in Times Square. We've had rallies in front of the White House. We've had marches through cities like Dallas, surprisingly. We discussed last week the dangers that we face as our open borders and our anti-Semitic media and universities bring us evil within in our midst, and they give them scholarships and microphones. But at some point, fortunately, there does come a pushback. Did notice Bill Maher, who is a noted leftist, but he seems to be more on the realist side of the left, called out the protesters on his program, just questioning, is this really what your values are? Because this is nuts. Major corporations and philanthropic organizations have severed their relationships with universities like Harvard and Penn. Of course, Penn decided that they don't care, and they wrote a scathing letter in response. But they'll get theirs. Major law firms have rescinded job offers to terrorist-loving students from Harvard and other elite law schools. Students who knowingly signed on to support the rape, torture, and murder of women and children in Israel. Now, whoa, some people are saying on the left, I thought, and even some on the right, in the center, sort of the libertarian side of things, whoa, cancel culture, I thought that was a bad thing. Well, it is, but until now, cancel culture has always exclusively been aimed at the right. And for stupid reasons, like voting a specific way. If you vote Republican, or if you support gun rights, or if you question vaccines or election integrity, or if you declare obvious biological truths. But now, cancel culture is falling on the heads of the left, and I can't help that sense of schadenfreude. But I also know that the cancel culture that the left is finally beginning to experience doesn't have anything to do with the kind of things that cancel culture manifested and foisted upon the right. It has to do with basic humanity. If you support the murder of innocent children, women and children, the rape of women and children in Israel, you are a racist piece of crap, and you should have to suffer the consequences. Losing a job offer because you support mass murder is a little bit different than being targeted because you believe men and women are different. And I still see a lot of talk about support for Israel, both pro and con, from the right and among Christians. And I thought I would address a couple of those things here. Talk a little bit about why we should support Israel. Now, the first thing that I wanted to address was this idea that we have to support Israel because it's the promised land, because it's the Israel spoken of by Christ in the Gospels. It's the Israel of the Old Testament. It's the fulfillment of prophecy, which is a bunch of hooey, because it's absolutely not. It's in the same place geographically, essentially, but it's not biblical Israel. The united kingdom of Israel, as we read about in the Old Testament, it ceased to exist in the 10th century, before Christ was born. The divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah were subsequently conquered by the Persians, the Babylonians, and eventually the Romans. The Old Testament tells us about the return of Israelites from captivity and the rebuilding of the temple, but then the Romans put an end to all that after the Bar Kokhba revolt I think it was in the 1st century, after Christ was born, somewhere in, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm thinking it's the mid-70s. And the Romans then destroyed the whole place and destroyed the temple again and renamed it Palestine as an insult to the Jews who rose up against the emperor in Rome. It later fell under the control of Muslims, alternately the Crusaders, the Mamluk Turks, the Ottoman Empire, and then it was partitioned at the end of the First World War and given over as a mandate to the Brits to manage. The modern secular state of Israel was founded in 1948. And on a side note, there has never been a Palestinian state. There was never a nation called Palestine, by the way. Never in history has that been the case. That whole notion is an invention of Western powers, mainly the U.S., who has tried to appease Palestinian terrorists by offering them land for peace, which they do not want. But that is another story. I'm digressing a bit from my original point. So no, the Israel we speak of today, in Christian terms, is the church. When you sing hymns talking about Israel, you're talking about God's people. You're not talking about the nation of Israel. The modern secular state of Israel has more in common with the kings of Israel and Judah who turned their back on God and allowed the worship of pagan gods in Israel and invited God's wrath upon them. It has more in common with them than it does with the Israel of the Bible. We are, as Christians, we don't really have any call to support or defend Israel based on the Bible. There simply isn't any support for that. But we should support them for several more realistic reasons. I'm not more, and I don't mean realistic like I mean in terms of realpolitik. I guess that's the way. And more political, more political reasons. Let's just say that. The U.S. has historically been a force for good in the world. We fought the Second World War against the genocidal tyrannies of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. We simply cannot stand by and watch as our ally, the only Western-style democracy in the region, is assaulted and potentially destroyed. Not our problem, not our monkeys is not a formula for international diplomacy. We have seen here in the U.S. what radical Islam does. We know American citizens have suffered mass killings, airplane hijackings and bombings, the destruction of the Twin Towers, the attack on the Pentagon, the bombings of our embassies in Africa and Beirut, the capture, torture, and beheadings of our citizens. We know what radical Islam is, but nobody knows it better than Israel. We are not on the front lines in the fight against radical Islam. Literally, Israel is. And as I stated before, and we'll talk about in a moment, we can't continue to abandon our allies as we have over the years in so many conflicts around the world. And that brings me to this point. We have a responsibility to support Israel because they, like Ukraine, face threats that we caused. For all my criticisms of President Trump, his greatest achievement was the Abraham Accords, a series of peace treaties between Arab states and Israel. Arab states which had for decades had as part of their constitution, as part of their charter, the destruction of Israel as a goal, forming an alliance of interests in the region against the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism, Iran. Saudi Arabia was in negotiations to join the Abraham Accords as well. And that all ended when Joe Biden came into office and just shat on everything. He began sending money to Iran and Gaza and the Palestinian Authority again, which ultimately paid for this latest attack on Israel. He restarted the Iran nuclear deal that Trump had shut down, which Obama had started in the first place thanks to stacks of cash. And now, Iran, the greatest sponsor of terror around the world, is resurgent, flush with cash from the U.S. to fund terror through Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who, by the way, fired a cruise missile at Israel this week, forcing a U.S. warship to intercept and shoot them down. That's all because of us. The hope of peace between Israel and Saudi is now gone. So we've created the current mess in the Middle East. We snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. A peace treaty between Saudi Arabia, the home of Islam, Saudi Arabia and Israel normalizing relations would have been huge. And it just went up in smoke. Thanks to Joe Biden. All because our brain-dead president, who's been wrong about every foreign policy issue in his entire career, has some crazy notion that if you send enough money to our global enemies, they will be nice. Yes, we do need to reduce our intervention in world affairs. Other countries should be able to handle their own problems without us. But brainiacs in the US and in Europe have for centuries redrawn maps and tried to create some utopia while knowing nothing about the nations or the people that they've ruled over or manipulated. Many of the world's bloodiest conflicts were the result of maps drawn by arrogant diplomats in Europe. And some of those diplomats were American, by the way. We do need to allow people to determine their own destinies rather than drawing arbitrary borders around them and expecting them all to get along. The Balkans, the current conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, East and West Germany, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East, all of those places where conflict and misery have followed the ignorant fumblings of the so-called civilized West, the intelligentsia in the civilized West. But with that in mind, we can't simply quit cold turkey and say to our friends around the world, you just work this out for yourself. We'll be over here. We're taking our ball and going home. Especially if we had a hand in causing the problems that they're facing currently. You can't stir up a hornet's nest in your neighbor's yard and then leave them to fight off the bees. It's just, you can't do that. And finally, and most pertinent to our mission here on the podcast, the issue of gun rights. We've always been told that Israel doesn't suffer these kinds of things because they don't have the mass shootings that we have or whatever. Their citizens are all armed. You know, you've heard these tropes about how every citizen, you've seen the pictures of teachers with or rifles over their shoulders, that kind of stuff, or guns on their hips. It turns out that that really is not the case and never was. Maybe it was 50 years ago. Only about 3%, it turns out, 3% of Israeli citizens are licensed to carry a firearm. They have very strict licensing restrictions, very tough restrictions on firearm ownership and carrying of firearms in a nation surrounded by enemies with, as far as I know, required military service, compulsory military service, unless they've reduced or eliminated that requirement. They have terrorist groups on 3 borders, and only 3% of their citizens are armed. I read a story last week about a woman in one of the kibbutzim in the southern part of Israel near Gaza who did have a gun, and she organized the citizens of her community, and not a single civilian in that kibbutz was killed. Imagine if more men and women had been armed in Israel. How many lives would have been saved? Now, when we talk, we like to say that the Second Amendment is for everyone. And normally when we say that here in the U.S., we talk about everyone here in the U.S. We talk about people of different ethnicities, people of different creeds and colors and genders. But it really is greater than that. It is beyond just our borders. The Second Amendment is simply a recognition of a right that all people have to defend themselves, a right given not by the Constitution and not by our government, but by God. And this is a sad lesson that Israel has learned. Hopefully they're learning. Ukraine as well. They had no tradition of civilian gun ownership or concealed carry prior to being invaded by Russia. And hopefully they've learned that lesson as well. Imagine if Israel and Ukraine had been like America, that nation that Japan feared to invade because, as Pastor Bennett pointed out last week, they feared that there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. Imagine if every kibbutz had had, every family had had firearms. Imagine if the citizens of Bucha had been armed. If that had happened, certainly 1,500 Israelis would not have been slaughtered. You would not have seen entire families murdered, women and children dragged out into the streets, men and women dragged out into the streets in northern Ukraine and shot, women and children dragged from their homes in Israel and murdered. And hopefully that painful lesson has been learned by both governments, and they will expand the rights of their citizens to defend themselves. Hopefully, we will learn from those mistakes, because we can now see in real time the effect, and not just in hypotheticals. We often hear that refrain that, well, if the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 1940s had been armed, they wouldn't have been as easily rounded up and murdered. People with ARs don't get in cattle cars, as my friend Yehuda Reamer, the Pew Pew Jew, says. But that's always been a hypothetical argument. Now we can see in real time as the events in Ukraine and Israel unfold, we can see almost instantaneously the tragic result when government do-gooders don't trust their citizens to be armed for their own protection. We can now point to Israel and Ukraine as examples of what happens when a government disarms its citizens, and then learns that lesson and turns around and starts arming them. But I can hear you say, we're here in the U.S., we're safe, right? We don't have Russia or Hamas on our borders. I mean, come on. One only needs to look at our southern border for just a minute to see what can happen potentially here. We have unknown numbers of military-age men from terrorist hotspots around the world already in this country. Because if the Border Patrol is catching thousands of them, they're catching a fraction. We have violent drug cartels controlling the border. We have coyotes and drug smugglers, armed men, moving across the border into our country to traffic people and drugs in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And we have a media, an academia, and politicians who are stoking hatred in this country among our citizens, and our immigrants. Israel needs our support because their government failed them in the most basic way. They failed to allow law-abiding citizens to defend themselves, despite living on a border with psychopathic savages who want to eradicate them. So we should fight. We should work to support them as they fight back against this awful terror and aggression, but also keeping in mind that the rights that we enjoy here in the U.S., those people didn't have. And the same people who created the messes in Israel and Ukraine want to take away your right to defend yourself. And we can see the results of that in real time, sadly. All right, that's what's been on my mind this week as I've watched events unfolding in the Middle East. I hope you will check out the feedback page and let me know what you think about this. Share your thoughts on these issues if you have any comments or any questions. Visit armedlutheran.us/feedback, leave us a voice message, and let us know what you think. We would love to hear from you. Again, that's all for me this week. Next week will be our online hangout for October 2023. I'll be sending out announcements for that in the coming days. And if you are a member, I look forward to seeing you there. If you are not, I hope you will sign up and come and join us. We would love to have you be with us and share your thoughts and your life stories and all that good stuff. It's always fun to hang out, and I hope you will be a part of the next one. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback or a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.